chamber.
Everywhere I go, I'm in the spotlight. This is a good life. I'm living bold. This is what it looks like. On the tippity top of the world.
Did you notice that the FMC quietly dropped the detention and demurrage rulemaking last week? Let me say that again. The detention and demurrage rulemaking is out. What's in it, you say? I'm going to tell you. Stick around. Hi, welcome to By Land and by Sea, an attorney breaking down the week in supply chain, presented by the Maritime Professor, me. I'm Lauren Beagen, founder of the Maritime Professor and Squall Strategies. And I'm your favorite maritime attorney. Join me every week as we walk through both ocean transport and surface transport topics in the wild world of supply chain. As always, the guidance here is general and for educational purposes only. It should not be construed to be legal advice, and there is no attorney-client privilege created by this video. If you need an attorney, contact an attorney. So before we get into the discussion of the day, let's go through my top 3 stories of the week. So story number 1. Last week, we covered the unreasonable refusal to deal or negotiate with respect to vessel space. There are no new comments in. Did you hear that? No new comments. And there's only 2 comments that were filed that we talked about last week. The last comment is still the request for an extension to November 7th. Reminder, these comments are due October 21st. And the FMC chairman, Dan Maffei, has said that in general, they're happy to have blanket extensions. But since they're under the gun to have this rulemaking completed by December 16th, it's required by OSRA. They have to have this rule done, final, published in the Federal Register, or at least published publicly, I'd say, by OSRA on December 16th. They don't really have the luxury of extending the deadline. Already, they're going to have a pretty quick turnaround, October 21st, to get everything buttoned up, finalized through the internal process of the FMC, where everybody signs off on new language, not to mention synthesizing all the comments. But I mean, really, if there's only one comment that addresses what they're asking and a second comment that asks for more time, maybe they don't need 6 weeks to go through that. Look, my advice, not legal advice, just general advice. Get your thoughts together here. Get ready for that October 21st deadline if you can. Try to assume that it's going to stick. That's 1 more week. Today's the 14th. We have 1 more week. Assume that deadline's going to stick, because at this point, I mean, they really got to scoop fast for December 16th. So if they do extend it, you'll find yourself with a little extra time. If they don't, at least you are ready. Look, at least you are ready for that October 21st. October 21st. This is for the unreasonable refusal to deal or negotiate with respect to vessel space. It's a big one. It's a big deal. It's important that we all understand what's happening. If you want to know what's happening in that rulemaking, go check out my old episode. I covered it. I break it down. You can then use my episode, think about your own things that relate to it, and then start putting your comments together and sending them over. This is so important that we participate in this process. I really, really encourage you to get your thoughts together. Story number 2. The detention and demurrage rule has been released. We're going to be talking about it today, but I wanted to put it in the stories. I put it in my stories last week. It's just important. Look, story number 3, we're going to get right into this. But we referenced today a lot of things. So story number 3 today is just that this is a podcast now. We've been on LinkedIn Live for quite a while now. Actually, I think at the turn of the new year was when we started doing the LinkedIn Lives here. We've been doing them quite a bit. But if you weren't sure, if you didn't know, I have a podcast. This has turned into a podcast now. It's By Land and by Sea. It's on all podcast platforms. If you're not following it, make sure that you do that. Make sure that you're downloading the old episodes. You can reference old things. That's why I went to the podcast platform. After this live, I turned the audio around. I put it on the podcast platform. And then you can go back and check out. You know, I cover the first rulemaking, the unreasonable refusal to deal and negotiate. Today, we're covering detention and demurrage. I cover the interpretive rule from May 2020 that today's rulemaking that we're going to be talking about talks about. So you can go back and check that out. I usually update these topics, so you might see the same topic a few different times. Go back and check out that podcast. Subscribe to it. It's pretty fun. The things that you see covered on this LinkedIn Live are what's in that podcast exactly. So take a look at it. So without further ado, let's get into the meat and potatoes of the day. Didn't want to spend a whole lot of time on the hot topics. So we're back to talking about the Ocean Shipping Reform Act of 2022. Remember, OSRA passed. We talk about this every week, it seems. OSRA passed on June 16th, 2022. So June 16th this summer. So they used the Senate version, and I always like to mention that because there were some differences between the House version and the Senate version at the time. I liked the Senate version a little bit better, so I'm happy that they went in that direction. So OSRA 22 came out June 16th. So what happened in OSRA 22? The law directed the FMC to do some things, and some of those things were initiate some rulemakings. We've talked about this a lot. There were three main rulemakings. The three highly anticipated rulemakings were unreasonable refusal to deal with respect to vessel space. That came out. Detention, demurrage, prohibited practices. That's what we're talking about today. So there's only one left. Unfair, unjust, discriminatory methods. That one's going to be huge. I am so excited to see that one because that's what a lot of people are worried about. If they start to rock the boat, there's only so many carriers out there, right? So, we need to identify what is an unfair or unjust discriminatory method. I think that's going to give maybe a lot of confidence. I don't know. I mean, operationally, if there's bad blood, hopefully we stay kind of, business minded. It's fine. Disputes happen and you won't get blacklisted from anybody, but that's what people are worried about. There's only so many carriers. And if you're blacklisted from a couple of them, So this would be unfair, unjust, discriminatory methods so that there won't be those blacklists, hopefully. I don't know. We'll see. I'm excited to see that rulemaking. But look, we have two of the three. The FMC is cruising right along. So we've talked about the first one a whole bunch, rulemaking on unreasonable refusal to deal or negotiate with respect to vessel space. Look, not later than 30 days after the enactment, the FMC had to initiate this rulemaking. And so what that rulemaking, this is the first rulemaking, this is the one that we covered last week and previously, defining unreasonable refusal to deal or negotiate with respect to vessel space under section 41104A10. So basically, this was the unreasonable refusal to deal. There's a lot of definitions in there. They have to issue that within 6 months. We talked about that December 16th. That's 2 months from now. So just last Friday, what happened recently? Just last Friday, October 7th, the FMC quietly in the afternoon, and maybe not so quietly, they just posted it on their website. You should be subscribing to the news releases or checking the FMC website. They released the second rulemaking. So the OSRA language, the Ocean Shipping Reform Act language, says not later than 45 days after the date of enactment. Remember, this was the initiate versus publish, but they were supposed to initiate the rulemaking further defining prohibited practices by common carriers, marine terminal operators, shippers, and ocean transportation intermediaries under, this is a section of the Shipping Act that it mentions, section 41102C, which is general prohibitions, practices in handling property under the Shipping Act. So that's under the code. So regarding the assessment of demurrage and detention charges, that's what OSRA said. This is the OSRA language. The FMC had to initiate a rulemaking defining prohibited practices by common carriers, MTOs, shippers, OTIs, regarding the assessment of D&D charges. So the FMC shall issue a final rule defining the practices not later than 1 year after the date. So they have this rule isn't due until June 16th. So it's great that they're getting a start on it. It's great that they're moving forward. Further, OSRA says the rule shall only seek to further clarify reasonable rules and practices related to the assessment of D&D to address the issues identified in the final rule on May 18th, 2020, interpretive rule on D&D under the Shipping Act. So that's, look, I did an episode on that. That's the interpretive rule of demurrage and detention under the Shipping Act. Go check out on the podcast. You can go see what's in the interpretive rule on D&D. Go check that one out. The language of OSRA continues. So there's FMC has to go back and clarify reasonable rules and practices relating to the assessment of D&D charges with respect to the interpretive rule from May 2020, including a determination of which parties may be appropriately billed for any D&D or other similar per container charges. Okay, so let's break some of that down. I did while we were talking about it. Let's break that down. The Shipping Act section that's referenced is the General Prohibitions section, and it's section C, Practices in Handling Property. So what does that say? So that's a common carrier, practices in handling property. A common carrier, marine terminal operator, or OTI, ocean transportation intermediary, may not fail to establish, observe, and enforce just and reasonable regulations and practices related to or connected with receiving, handling, storing, or delivering property. Okay, so pretty baseline stuff. And this is supposed to help clarify the interpretive rule, like I said, from May 2020. So in that interpretive rule, that's where we find the incentive principle. We've talked about that before. The D&D, the FMC has said, D&D should be used for incentivizing the movement of goods. That interpretive rule through OSRA was actually adopted and codified into 46 CFR 545.5, Interpretation of Shipping Act of 1984, Unjust and Unreasonable Practices with respect to D&D. Okay, so let's talk about that. What actually went into the law? So like I said, this is all baselining so that we can talk about what was released on Friday for this D&D rule. But that incentive principle actually already got thrown into the CFR, the regs of the FMC. So it's section 545.5, Interpretation of Shipping Act, Unjust, Unreasonable Practices with respect to demurrage and detention. This pulled in some of that stuff from the interpretive rule. So the applicability and scope of this rule, as it's outlined, this rule applies to practices and regulations relating to demurrage and detention for containerized cargo, of course. For purposes of this rule, the terms D&D, detention, demurrage, encompass any charges, including per diem, assessed by ocean common carriers, marine terminal operators, and OTIs, basically all the regulated entities related to the use of marine terminal space or shipping containers, not including freight charges. So they're kind of just outlining, saying, I don't care what you call it. If it's quacking, it's a duck. They're saying per diem, whatever. They talk about this a little bit more in the D&D rule, but it's interesting that they have it there. I love that they have it there. Then they talk about the incentive principle. They say in assessing the reasonableness of D&D practices and regulations, the Commission will consider the extent to which D&D are serving their intended primary purpose as financial incentives to promote freight fluidity. So I want to pause. There's not a lot of case law necessarily on this yet. So what we're seeing is the FMC is saying, look, this should be a charge that's made for increasing or promoting freight fluidity, the movement of goods, the incentivizing of goods. They do talk a little bit in this rule specifically, you can go look it up, particular applications of the incentive principle. So they talk about cargo availability. The Commission may consider in the reasonableness analysis. So not saying any directives, not saying any specifics here, but they're saying they might consider the extent to which demurrage practices and regulations relate demurrage or free time to cargo availability for retrieval. So like if you can't go pick it up, are they still charging you? What are the reasons for not being able to pick it up? No case law, no specifics here, but they're saying they could consider that. They also talk about empty container return, absent extenuating circumstances, practices and regulations that provide for imposition of detention when it does not serve its incentivizing purposes, such as when empty containers cannot be returned, are likely to be found unreasonable. They're saying if you're not letting an empty container be returned, but you're still charging detention, they're saying that's likely to be found unreasonable. Not specifically, but they're saying likely. This is kind of what we're thinking. Like I said, this is already a rule. This is in the regulation. This is part 545.5. You can look this up. This is what happened from the incentive principle or the interpretive rule that came out from May 2020. OSRA turned this into a rule. It just did it. Congress just did it. It turned it into a rule. So notice of cargo availability in assessing, this is also in the rule, in assessing the reasonableness of demurrage practices and regulations, the Commission may consider whether and how regulated entities provide notice to cargo interests that cargo is available for retrieval. The Commission may consider the type of notice, to whom notice is provided, the format of notice, the method of distribution of notice, the timing of notice, and the effect of notice. Basically, you got to tell them that it's available. And if you're not, the FMC is going to be taking that into consideration. How can they come get it? Why are you still charging them when the charge is supposed to be for incentivizing the movement of goods? But if you're not telling them that it's ready, but they're otherwise ready to come pick it up, how are they to know? That's part of it. That's part of what they said in the interpretive rule, and that's part of what ended up becoming a rule here. Government inspections, something that a lot of people are interested in. This is a rule. This is already a rule. This is what OSRA turned into a rule. In assessing the reasonableness of demurrage and detention practices in the context of government inspections, the Commission may consider the extent to which D&D are serving their intended purpose and may also consider any extenuating circumstances. Very vague, but reading between the lines here, it's like if a government inspection is happening, I don't know, how can you be charging a charge that's supposed to incentivize the movement of goods if it's kind of on a clock stop, right? I mean, if it's kind of on this, like, nobody's allowed to move it, who's supposed to charge, who's supposed to get that, that money. It's not an imposition necessarily to the terminal. I mean, I guess partially it is. And that's what was in that interpretive rule is basically they said, incentivization principle. This is what the charge is supposed to be for, incentivizing the movement of goods. The FMC recognized that a little bit could be covered for operational purposes, but they basically said, look, it's supposed to incentivize the movement. And so found money, I guess, is how you could put that. Not necessarily something that's supposed to be offsetting operational costs, because that's not necessarily what it's for, although a little bit, but in general. So government holds, that's a tough one, but they're saying they're going to weigh that into the consideration here. Demurrage and detention policies. This is that same rule we're going over, 545.5. The Commission may consider in the reasonableness analysis the existence, accessibility, content, and clarity of policies implementing D&D practices, including dispute resolution policies and practices. So they were setting the stage saying that they're going to be considering everything that you have around D&D. Is it clear? Is it easy to read? Is it funky, or is it fine? They're going to be taking that into the reasonableness here. Transparent terminology. Of course, that's going to be factored in. And basically, they say nothing in this rule is actually precluding the Commission from considering other factors. They're making it very wide open that these are things that we're thinking about, but these are not the only things. So look, now the Commission, that is a rule. That is a current rule. That's a regulation that's in the CFR that the FMC administers based on the interpretive rule of May 2020. So now the Commission is refining all of that. OSRA told them, look, we got that in the books, but now we want to know. That was only the kind of starting line. Now we want to go. Are there other factors that the Commission consistently reviews? Are there other parts that need to be part of this decision? So we've been waiting for this D&D rule. We've been setting the baseline here. I hope everybody's on the same page because now we're going to dive into it. So what's in it? What is this rule? This new detention demurrage rule. It's kind of a continuation of what we already saw. So this is the Notice of Proposed Rulemaking. We've talked about this before. Previously, the FMC released an advance Notice of Proposed Rulemaking. That was last spring. I think it was in April. They asked about billing practices, information that should be contained in the invoices. That was all pre-OSRA. Remember, OSRA happened in June. In April, the FMC was talking about D&D already. They were already on their way. They sent out this advance notice of proposed rulemaking and they were asking questions. So that was all pre-OSRA, which OSRA, as we know, created the list of 13 required invoice items that hadn't previously been mandated. Now they are. There were a lot of comments when ANPRM, when the advance notice of proposed rulemaking, the D&D happened previously, commenting that a 30-day invoice requirement after a D&D had concluded, I mean, should be a baseline, should be something that's there. Look, you kind of think about it. It's crazy to think that pre-OSRA and really pre-FMC leaning in on this issue, I mean, pre-last year, essentially, the invoices could basically just be a napkin with a number on it that said, demurrage invoice. I mean, look, maybe it wasn't ever that casual, but maybe it was. I can imagine some people out there, you're probably listening right now saying, yeah, actually a napkin with a number on it would probably be more clear than what I received. So it's just so crazy how far we've come that I really do support this effort because we're providing guardrails. These aren't really stringent requirements that the FMC is putting out there. They could have dove in and been very prescriptive, very hands in the business. They're not. I don't think they are. I think what they're doing is just kind of providing, I mean, they're not even saying it needs to be on like a 9.5 by 11 inch piece of paper. They're basically just saying, look, the 13 requirements that OSRA created, one of them was like the amount actually due by the invoice. It's nice that that's required, right? I mean, there's a lot of other things, and that's kind of an overexample. But look, a napkin with an invoice amount due on it, like I said, might be pretty clear. So look, the ANPRM basically was asking, it requested the industry views on potential demurrage and detention billing practices, and it asked whether a proposed regulation on D&D billing practices should apply to NVOs, as well as VOCCs, the vessel operating common carriers, and whether the regulation should differ based on whether the billing party is the NVO or the VO. So that's where we were. That was the ANPRM. This is now, we're at the Notice of Proposed Rulemaking stage. So they've continued this. What was directed by OSRA and what they were previously doing with this ANPRM, this advance notice, where they were just kind of polling the crowd, sending some questions out to the industry. Now, all of that has been combined, and now we're at the Notice of Proposed Rulemaking stage. This is the stage where the FMC is advancing some language and some specific things that they're proposing to be in the rule. This is a critical time for the industry to respond because the next step after this NPRM is the final rule. And usually when it's the final rule, unless there's significant adverse comments, usually those final rules take effect 30 days after publication. So this is the last real true step, assuming that it kind of runs under a normal process. This is the last real true step that you are being asked to interact with the commission. You're being asked to respond and give your thoughts. So put your thoughts together, get your comments together. We have 60 days to file comments on this rulemaking. So comments are due December 13th. Even though it was published on October 7th and it's 60 days, it's always based on when it gets published in the Federal Register. So December 13th is the 60 days mark from when these comments are due. So a lot of people are thinking about detention demurrage. You have 60 days. And actually, this rule isn't required to be finalized for 1 year from the OSRA. So June 16th next year, 2023. It's possible that they're going to be allowing extensions. It seems like there's extension requests for all comments these days. 60 days, that's pretty good. Get your thoughts together. We've been knowing that this was going to be coming down the line. Now we know what's in it, and that's what we're about to go over. So before we start, though, I do want to really highlight. So this is now the platform now is regulations.gov. So there's some actually pretty nice features. So previously you would file your comment, secretary@fmc.gov, send it in, you'd make sure to include the docket. Now you can just submit your comments directly to the docket, and it's over at regulations.gov. I did notice that the e-reading room on the FMC website hasn't really been updated, or maybe this rulemaking is not easily findable right there. This rulemaking is a continuation of the ANPRM, so it is a continuation of a previously assigned docket. But basically what's happening now is it's over at regulations.gov. You can search for the Federal Maritime Commission. I recommend putting quotations around Federal Maritime Commission so that it gets you right there. You'll see 2 dockets come up, and this is the first one. There's some pretty nice features, notably subscribing to the docket, so you're alerted every time documents are filed. I'm not sure if that actually includes the comments, but we'll find out. I'm subscribed. So I want to note that they combined, like I said, this ANPRM rulemaking. So the comments actually show in regulations.gov 83 comments. Actually, only one of those comments was recently filed after this notice of proposed rulemaking was issued. So it was filed anonymously. I don't recommend filing anonymously, but again, not legal advice, just a general thought. It was a little stream of consciousness. I really recommend a formal letter where you explain your company, explain its role in the supply chain, go over how the rule relates to you, and really any suggestions you have, or respond to the questions being asked by the rulemaking. Make it a story. This is your moment to have that conversation with the FMC. It's going to be written product, but this is the moment of having that conversation. Imagine that you're having a meeting with one of the commissioners. What would you say? Put it in this letter. Put it in the comments. Okay, so that's enough background. What's in it? The proposed rule is saying that it's going to do 4 things. 1, adopt minimum information that common carriers must include in a D&D invoice that's already been listed under the 13. So this would adopt those 13 invoices, and there's a little clarification to a few of them. 2, add to this list additional information that must be included in or with a D&D invoice. 3, further define prohibited practices by clarifying which parties may be appropriately billed for D&D charges. And 4, establish billing practices that billing parties must follow when invoicing the D&D charges. So the rule goes through the summarizing of the comments of the ANPRM. There's a lot there. This is a 58-page document, so there's actually a lot that we're even still going to cover today, going through some of the specifics. But I think maybe next week I'll cover the summarizing of the comments of the ANPRM from the FMC's perspective. I summarized a few of them as they were coming in last spring. You can check that out on the podcast. But I think that it's valid to go over the FMC's summarizing of those comments. It's really interesting information there. But for today, we're just going to be going over what this current NPRM is doing. So to begin, the rule revisits the definition of detention demurrage. It says, Commission defines the terms D&D broadly to include any charge assessed by common carriers and MTOs related to the use of marine terminal space or shipping containers. The proposed definition is the same as the scope used in the interpretive rule in 46 CFR 545.5. The goal is to encompass all charges having the purpose or effect of D&D, regardless of the labels given to those charges. Like I said, if it quacks, it's a duck. That's what they're saying. A charge assessed by a common carrier for the use of containers outside a marine terminal, so you're using the box, would fall under the scope of this rule, regardless of whether the charge was called detention or per diem. The use of the box outside of the designated marine terminal. That's detention. That's what they're saying. Well, I don't care what you call it. That's detention. They also say a charge assessed because the container is taking up terminal space would fall under the scope of this rule, even if the billing party called the charge something other than demurrage. So if it's the box sitting somewhere in that terminal and it's taking up space and it's kind of like the rent for taking up that space, that's demurrage. I don't care what you call it. That's demurrage. The proposed rule specifically limits these definitions to shipping containers and excludes charges related to other equipment such as chassis because depending on the context, per diem can refer to containers, chassis, or both. That's verbatim. That's what the FMC says in this rulemaking. The FMC also says that they support defining D&D charges based on what asset is the source of the charge, land or container, as opposed to the location of the container inside or outside a terminal. They also say the Commission discouraged the use of terms such as storage and per diem as synonyms for demurrage or detention because these terms add additional complexity. Despite how it may be used in the industry, to ensure clarity, the Commission generally favors using the term per diem to refer to the use of chassis. So they're saying, look, get the word per diem out of your mouth unless you're talking about chassis. Really, detention and demurrage should be the terms. There's enough societal attention on detention and demurrage now that I think we all kind of know what we're talking about, especially as it relates to ocean shipping. And maybe this will flow through to the inland portion, that we really kind of streamline what we're talking about when we say per diem or demurrage or detention. But I think we really, that's what the FMC is saying here, is that to avoid that confusion, we need to be using them consistently and not calling ducks mallards or anything else. You know, we need to call a duck a duck. The Commission proposes to broadly define demurrage or detention invoice as meaning any statement printed, written, or accessible online that documents an assessment or of demurrage or detention charges. They say by proposing this broad definition, they're trying to include an existing variety of methods employed by common carriers and MTOs to invoice the shippers and to leave room for improvements of existing systems or adopting any new innovative invoicing methods. They're basically just saying, look, statement printed, written, or accessible online that documents the assessment of demurrage or detention. They're not going to lean too far in on what the invoice needs to look like. Is it a 9x11? Is it, whatever, is it you send a Venmo? I mean, I don't know. Can you send a Venmo? Maybe you can. They're saying they're not defining what it needs to look like. Billed party definition. They are defining some other things. Billed party, the FMC is saying, is meaning the person receiving the demurrage or detention invoice and who is responsible for the payment of any incurred D&D charge. Billed party, receiving, but also responsible. The proposed definition would best capture the intended scope of this term and eliminate any potential ambiguity to its coverage. So the FMC goes into a little bit on the billing party. This proposed rule would define the term billing party as meaning. They're defining who is the billing party. VOCC, this is billing party, VOCC, NVOCC, or MTO who issues a D&D invoice. The Commission acknowledges currently in most circumstances the billing party will be the VO. For purposes of this proposed rule, this term is defined broadly to incorporate the occasions when an MTO or an NVO may actually be issuing the D&D invoice. They also continue, and they define billing dispute, which means any disagreement with respect to the validity of the charges, okay, or the method of their invoicing raised by the billed party or the agent to the billing party. This proposed definition, and more generally, this proposed rule, does not indicate a preference or requirement for the format in which a dispute may be raised. Instead, the Commission proposes a broad definition that incorporates all types of disputes raised by a billed party upon receiving a D&D invoice. Look, I'm going to add that the FMC really encourages dispute mechanisms. So they want you to try to figure this out if you can yourself. If you're issuing this invoice, there should be a dispute mechanism. There should be a way for the billed party to dispute that charge. And look, here's something, not a junk mechanism where you give out fake numbers or fake emails, or what seems like fake numbers or fake emails, where you let the build party sit on the phone for hours, but an actual honest method for disputing the mechanism. Look, I might even suggest that the FMC write these examples, this junk email, junk phone number, into the final definition here as an example of what billing disputes does not include: junk phone numbers, junk emails, or no real billing dispute mechanism because of the inability to actually reach someone. Are you listening, FMC? I don't know. Maybe, maybe not. Look, somebody maybe add it to your comments. We'll get that. We'll get that. Hopefully that'll somehow come in. They also go into properly issued invoices. So under the proposed rule, a properly issued invoice is an invoice that is only issued to the person that has contracted with the billing party for the carriage of goods or space to store cargo, and is therefore the person responsible for the payment of any incurred demurrage or detention charge. So the FMC says this is often the shipper of record. The proposed rule would prohibit billing parties from issuing demurrage and detention invoices to persons other than the person for whose account the billing party provided ocean transportation or storage. So I'm just gonna read this as the FMC so this is what the FMC is saying in the rulemaking. As a result of anecdotal reports indicating that billing parties sometimes sent invoices to multiple parties for the same shipments, the Commission asked whether the practice occurred regularly. Many commenters described a current widespread practice where the billing party sends the invoice to multiple parties, most of whom are not the recipient of the service giving rise to the invoice charge. The current system, in which parties who did not negotiate contract terms with the billing party are nonetheless bound by them, creates additional confusion and hardship and exacerbates the problem in the supply chain. It's too many people involved with not enough direct knowledge of what's actually happening or what's supposed to happen. And I think that's it. If you don't know what's supposed to happen, how can you know if this is real or not, or incorrect or correct? For example, one commenter noted, I'm reading off of the FMC again, one commenter noted that the practice often results in disputes among the parties. Other comments noted that invoicing multiple parties results in duplicative payments, which further complicates resolving invoice disputes. The FMC continues, the Commission understands the concerns with invoices being sent to those individuals without a contractual relationship and acknowledges that this practice only exacerbates dispute resolution and efficient movement of cargo. Look, that's it. If you don't have that direct relationship, how do you know what's going on? The FMC talks about, it was pointed out in the final report of the Supply Chain Innovation Team initiative. So that was the SKY team that we talked about. That was a Commissioner Dye initiative. They quote, the FMC is quoting their final report, United States international supply chain is a complex, dynamic ecosystem. And the lack of direct customer relationships between actors in the system, such as shippers and terminals, impedes cooperative problem solving, exacerbates disruptions, and makes recovering from disruptions more difficult. FMC says, this is exactly the case where the motor carriers, customs brokers, and others who do not have contractual relationships with common carriers are being asked to resolve disputes. To continue on, the FMC says, the Commission believes that prohibiting billing parties from issuing demurrage and detention invoices to persons with whom they do not have a genuine commercial relationship will similarly benefit the supply chain. If the billed party has firsthand knowledge of the terms, then they are in a better position to ensure that both they and the carrier are abiding by those terms. Like I said, if you have that direct contractual relationship, you're going to know, is this what we agreed to? Is this consistent? Is this accurate? It's easier to kind of work those numbers. When D&D invoice disputes arise, the billed party is then in a better position than third parties such as truckers and customs brokers to analyze the accuracy of the charge. Practically speaking, the proposed rule prohibits billing parties from invoicing motor carriers or customs brokers. Although a motor carrier could pay on behalf of a billed party, the motor carrier would not be liable for those charges and could not be penalized for non-payment of charges. It's an interesting little twist here. So under the proposed rule, the FMC continues, only the person who contracted with the common carrier for the carriage or storage of goods may be issued an invoice. The FMC also says there's a variety of shipping arrangements that allocate risks, obligations, and costs between the shipper and the consignee named on the bill of lading. Considering these arrangements, the Commission is specifically now asking and seeking comment on whether it would be appropriate to also include the consignee named on the bill of lading as another person who may receive the D&D invoice. The proposed rule would simplify This is what they're saying. The proposed rule would simplify the current system and ensure that the only person with the most knowledge about the shipment and who is in the best position to understand and dispute the charge receives the D&D invoice. The Commission views the practice of sending an invoice to multiple parties involved in the shipping transaction rather than sending an invoice for D&D charges to the only person that has contracted with the billing party for the carriage of goods. It's untenable. Therefore, the proposed rule would prohibit such a practice and require that only the person that has contracted with the billing party for the carriage of goods or storage of goods receives an invoice for incurred demurrage or detention charges. So the direct contractual relationship. What do you think? What do you think this would look like in practice? I'm starting to think about what this would look like in practice. Maybe we need to get our terminal operating systems updated a bit to be more real-time accurate so that there's not a couple hours lag time, so that we know when the payments have been made so that those motor carriers can then pick up the goods. I mean, if they're going to be out of the circle, it needs to be pretty immediate knowing that payment's been made and that you can pick it up. Look, maybe that's something that gets added on to Commissioner Bensel's MTDI, the Maritime Transportation Data Initiative. TOS systems, terminal operating systems, that work closer to maybe PayPal, Venmo, they need to know if they can release the cargo, right? And if the contractual relationship is changing on who's paying for the invoice, then that system needs to be immediate. It's 2022, right? And we're almost 2023. Can you believe that? We're almost in 2023. That should be a thing. It should be immediate. All right, so now we're going to dive into a few other things, a little bit more description and less definition. So minimum billing information. The proposed rule requires common carriers and MTOs to include all the information required, the 13 items that were in the invoice requirements of OSRA. But then they're also going to include minimum information in addition to the information, in addition to those 13 things. These would include specific identifying, timing, rate, and dispute information. So the Commission requests comments on whether it should require billing parties to include all the proposed information in the D&D invoices. Okay, those are the 13. If the commenter opposes any of the proposed requirements, they should identify the information and the obstacles or burden to including such information onto D&D invoices. So this is going over those 13. Are there things under the OSRA 13 that you don't love, that are operationally really difficult, that are just something that's probably just not going to work? They want to know. If you support those 13, they want to know how the specific information will assist you in verifying the accuracy of the charge or ascertaining how the charge was calculated. They want to know, is this helpful? Is this hurtful? Is this something that you really, if you're going to need more information? So identifying information. On the proposed rule, the invoice must contain sufficient information to enable the billed party to identify the containers to which the charges apply, including bill of lading numbers, the container numbers for imports, the port of discharge, and the basis for why the invoice party is the proper party of interest and thus liable for the charge. Look, OSRA 22 requires the Invoices include the port of discharge and the container number. The proposed rule is clarifying that billing parties must only include port of discharge for import shipments because providing the port of discharge on a demurrage or detention invoice would be less useful in the context for an export. Makes sense, right? So bill of lading, they go into that. There was one comment that was against including bill of lading numbers, saying that it may violate contractual relationships. The FMC responded and said the bill of lading numbers are actually publicly available now via peers and other platforms. Because the bill of lading number provides valuable identifying information to the billed party, the Commission is proposing requiring this information on D&D invoices. The basis for why the party was invoiced, it's all around billing too many people and inappropriately receiving multiple payments for invoices being sent out. The FMC says requiring billing parties to identify the basis for why billed parties are liable for the charge would enable the billed parties to confirm that they are correctly billed for invoice charges. The proposed rule is consistent with proposed 541.4 that would prohibit billing parties from issuing D&D invoices to persons other than the person for whose account the billing party provided ocean transportation or space to store goods. The Commission continues, because the invoice would identify the basis for why the billed party is liable for the charge, they would be able to confirm that the billing party could issue an invoice to them under the proposed rule. So I mean, they want you to kind of justify why it's going to that billed party. Timing information. The proposed rule clarifies that the billing parties must only provide container availability dates for import shipments. The proposed rule would also require billing parties to specify the dates for which demurrage and detention charges accrued, the billing dates, and the billing due date. Makes sense. Import, D&D. Timing of billing, they talk about clock stopping events. So instead of requiring billing parties to identify specific clock stopping events on D&D invoices, the proposed rule, so they're saying basically, there were some comments saying that maybe there should be clock stopping events, maybe there should be government holds, etc. This is kind of flipping that a little bit and saying, instead of going into all of that, they're saying the proposed rule would require the billing party to identify the very specific dates on which they charge D&D. The proposed rule permits billing parties to take into account any intervening events that affected the charges, if known, and enables billed parties to confirm or dispute the validity of charges on specific dates. So that's what they're saying. Look, if you're not supposed to be, through case law or how things shake out, charging for, let's say, government holds, but you include that as part of your dates, then the billed party, the person receiving that invoice, can go back and say, shouldn't have charged me there. Those were government holds, or whatever turns out to be not supposed to be billed for time. The proposed rule incorporates the intent of OSRA to shift the burden to billing parties to justify the D&D charges while allowing billing parties to correct invoices when the intervening events are not initially known. So it's shifting the burden to the billing parties to justify the charges that are being sent out. So rate information. The proposed rule incorporates the rate information requirements contained in OSRA. It also clarifies that when billing parties provide the applicable detention and demurrage on which daily rate is based, the billing party should provide sufficient detail so the billed party is able to actually locate the specific rate. They want you to point to where are you getting this rate from, and just to make it easier for the billed party to say, yep, I recognize that. That's where that rate came from. There were some comments over maybe there would be some service confidentiality, but really if you're billing that invoice to that billed party and it's supposed to have a direct contractual relationship, that party's already privy to that, right? They were already part of that service contract. There shouldn't be service contract confidentiality problems there. That's what the FMC talks about. Dispute resolution. The proposed rule would require the invoice to include an email, a telephone number, or other appropriate contact information for questions or requests for fee mitigation, refund, or waiver. A website address of a publicly accessible portion of the billing party's website that provides a detailed description of information or documentation that the billed party must provide to successfully request fee mitigation, refund, or waivers, and define timeframes that comply with the billing practices in this part, during which the billed party must request the fee mitigation, refunds, or waivers. So they're basically saying you got to provide contact information, email, telephone, or other appropriate way of requesting the fee mitigation or refund or waiver, a website that explains your process, just to be totally clear, and there's going to be a timeline that we're about to talk about that the FMC is proposing. So, I kind of like that, right? The proposed rule also requires the invoice to include specific timeframes, which not only that you have to invoice the bill party, but that the bill party needs to file their grievance, their dispute with you. So the billing practices the FMC is proposing a 30-day time frame to issue D&D invoices. They're proposing that because, so they propose to excuse billed parties from actually being able to, let me start over. They're requiring 30 days for the invoice. The FMC is also saying that if you don't issue that invoice within 30 days, the billed party does not have to pay. It would then void that invoice because you sent it out too late. If you send it out on day 35, the billed party doesn't have to pay. The FMC says without such a provision, there would be no consequence for not actually meeting the 30-day time frame. They're saying, look, we're serious. We want you to send those invoices right away. Like I said, it could be a napkin. Previous to the FMC and OSRA, it could be a napkin with a number on it 6 years later. That's crazy. The FMC is also saying, okay, so you got 30 days to send out the invoice. They're also saying you have 30 days now from the date of receipt of that invoice to request fee mitigation, refund, or waiver, and collect the documentation to support its request. The proposed time frame, the FMC says, protects billed parties against unreasonable deadlines the billing parties may impose upon their customers. At the same time, the FMC, the 30-day dispute timeframe, would notify billed parties that if they plan to request fee mitigation, they have a limited amount of time from which they must submit such a request, and it would protect billing parties from untimely requests. It's just reining it all in, right? It's 30 days to send out the invoice, and it's 30 days to respond and say, we dispute this, we want more information, or we want a waiver. That's it. There's a lot there. This was a long discussion today, but that's it. That's what's in there. That's the too long didn't read, but even this is too long didn't read. I really encourage you to look through it. Rely on those headlines as you're reading through it. You'll see the sections broken out. You can dive in on parts that you're interested in. That's it. Get those comments in. We have 60 days. We're looking at a December 13th. We got to get this. This is our moment. I say it for all the rulemakings. We got 1 week for the first rulemaking. We got 60 days for the second. And I mean, the FMC's cranking them out. We might get a third rulemaking while we still have the second rulemaking open here. Look, as always, the guidance here is general and for educational purposes. It should not be construed to be legal advice directly related to your matter. If you need an attorney, contact an attorney. But if you do have any specific legal questions, feel free to reach out to me at my legal company, Squall Strategies. Otherwise, for the non-legal questions, the e-learning and general industry information and insights, come find me at the Maritime Professor. If you like these videos, let me know. Comment, like, and share. If you want to listen to these episodes on demand, or if you missed any previous episodes, check out the podcast by Land and by Sea. If you prefer to see the video, they live on my YouTube page by Land and by Sea, presented by the Maritime Professor. While you're at it, check out the website, maritime-professor.com. E-courses dropping soon. They are coming together, guys. So until next week, this is Lauren Beagen, the Maritime Professor, and you've just listened to By Land and by Sea. See you next time.